The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was almost the only thing you could hear at the cemetery. It was a quiet place, peaceful, respectful, and filled with history. The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rows of gravestones. The light of the fading day gave everything a soft, golden hue, creating an almost otherworldly atmosphere. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down. Each stone told a story of lives lived and lost, of heroes who had served their country, and of those left behind, remembering them. Among the graves, one figure stood tall, unmoving. Dressed in the traditional uniform of the Royal Guard, he seemed to blend into the surroundings, his silhouette strong and proud. His uniform was flawless, his red tunic bright against the green of the grass and the black hat sitting high on his head with its shiny brass buttons reflecting the last rays of the sun. His boots were polished to perfection, and his posture was as straight as an arrow. The Royal Guard was a symbol of discipline, respect, and honor. His job was not only to protect the memory of the fallen, but also to ensure that every person who came to visit would do so in peace, with reverence. The Royal Guard had been standing in the same spot for hours, without moving, without speaking. His role was simple in its purpose: stand still and observe, guarding the graves of those who had served before him. Yet the task itself was anything but simple. Every shift felt long, every hour stretched out, and the weight of responsibility never quite left his shoulders. There was an expectation of perfection in everything he did. He couldn't show signs of weakness. He couldn't break his silence. Every time someone passed by, he was to stand tall and make them feel as though they were not alone in their grief, as though he too understood the weight of loss. But standing guard, no matter how strict his training, didn't prevent the Royal Guard from thinking about the lives of the soldiers buried around him. He knew that every grave held a story, stories of sacrifice, love, bravery, and sometimes tragedy. But it was impossible for him to learn every story. He couldn't ask. He couldn't speak. So he stood day after day, carrying with him the weight of thousands of untold stories. He was the silent witness to their memories, yet he never truly knew them. As he stood, his mind occasionally wandered. He wondered about the soldiers who had fought in wars long before his time, men who had been buried here, forgotten by the world but not by the cemetery. The stones were their silent markers, the only reminders of their existence. The guard had been trained not to show any emotion, but there were times late in the afternoon when the cemetery was particularly quiet, when a feeling of sadness would creep up on him. Not for himself, but for the lives of those who had sacrificed everything, people who had given up their futures so others could have a chance at theirs. In the stillness of the cemetery, the guard felt a deep respect for the soldiers. He could almost hear their voices in the rustle of the leaves. Perhaps it was just his imagination, but in that moment, the spirits of the fallen soldiers seemed to whisper to him. Not with words, but with a sense of understanding that passed between the earth and the wind. He had never asked for this responsibility, but now that it was his, he had come to embrace it, even in its moments of silent grief. The life of a Royal Guard was one of precision and quiet sacrifice. People rarely noticed them, and when they did, it was for a brief moment of admiration, maybe even a sense of awe. But behind the polished boots, beneath the crisp uniform, was a person who, like everyone else, felt the pull of emotions. There were days when the guard would see a family, a mother, a father, or a child standing in front of one of the graves. They would kneel down and leave flowers or stand silently, sometimes weeping. Those moments were always difficult for him. As much as he wanted to step forward and offer comfort, his duty kept him rooted to the spot. He couldn't make himself a part of their grief, even though he felt it too. His job was to observe and protect, not to get involved. And yet there were times when he felt as if his heart could break alongside theirs. The sadness of those who came to mourn touched him in a way that he couldn't explain. It was as if he shared in their pain, even though he couldn't share their words. There were moments when the Royal Guard would remember the reasons why he chose this path. It wasn't for fame nor for recognition. He wasn't here for applause or praise. He had chosen this life because of something deeper, a commitment to his country, a love for its history, and a desire to honor those who had given everything for it. Standing guard wasn't just about duty. It was about keeping the memory of the fallen alive, making sure that people knew they hadn't been forgotten. His thoughts were interrupted by a rustle in the distance. A figure appeared on the path leading toward the graves. It was a woman. The royal guard's eyes remained steady, but his heart skipped a beat. Something about her was different from the usual visitors he had seen over the years. She wasn't just another tourist or passerby. There was an air of sadness about her, a weight in her steps, as though she carried the burden of something personal and profound. She walked slowly, almost as if lost in her thoughts, her hands folded gently in front of her. She was alone. He couldn't see her face yet, but there was something in the way she moved that caught his attention. Perhaps it was the quiet grace with which she carried herself, or perhaps it was the way her presence seemed to fill the space around her. The royal guard noticed her approach with quiet interest, but he didn't allow himself to make any assumptions. He couldn't. His role was to observe, not to judge. As the woman drew closer to the grave she was headed toward, the royal guard's attention remained fixed on her. It wasn't his place to intrude on her personal moment, but there was something about her that made him wonder. The woman stopped in front of a particular grave and looked down at the stone with a gentle sadness in her eyes. She placed her hand on the stone, her fingers brushing lightly over the engraved name. The guard didn't know whose grave it was. He didn't ask, but he could see the connection. There was something deeply personal between the woman and the soldier, whose name was carved into the stone. It was a bond that the guard could never truly understand, a bond formed in the quiet moments of loss. For a few moments all was still. The only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the distant calls of birds. The royal guard's stance remained unchanged, his gaze steady, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't help but feel that this moment was different, that something beyond his usual duty was happening here. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, but he couldn't yet understand why. The woman continued walking slowly, her footsteps quiet against the soft earth beneath her. The cemetery, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, seemed almost to be holding its breath. Everything was still, yet there was a sense of movement in the air, as if the very place was alive with the memories of those it held. As she walked, the woman's face remained soft, her expression a quiet mixture of sadness and calm. It was as though she was walking through a dream, her feet barely touching the ground, lost in her own world of thoughts and memories. The royal guard watched her, still standing perfectly straight at his post. He didn't move, not even the slightest shift. His focus remained entirely on her, though he couldn't explain why. There was something about her that caught his attention, something in the way she carried herself, in the way her movements were graceful and purposeful. She wasn't hurried. There was no rush in her step, no urgency. She walked slowly, methodically, as if the journey she was making was a sacred one, a path she had walked many times before. As she drew nearer to the grave she was headed toward, the guard could see more clearly. She was holding a single white flower, delicate and pure. The petals shimmered faintly in the sunlight as though they held a story of their own. Her hand gripped it gently, almost as if it was something fragile that she couldn't bear to let go of. Her fingers were trembling, but the tremor was so small, so subtle, that only someone paying close attention could notice it. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze fixed ahead, and yet her movements were deliberate. She knew exactly where she was going, and her purpose was clear. The closer she came to the grave, the more the royal guard began to sense the depth of her grief. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't a grief that demanded attention. No, this was a quiet, private sorrow, one that spoke in the softest of whispers. He could see the way she gently knelt in front of the gravestone, her body almost folding into the earth, as if the very act of getting close to the ground was a way to feel closer to the person who lay beneath it. The guard couldn't hear her words, but he could see the subtle movements of her lips. Perhaps she was speaking to the soldier, or perhaps she was lost in a memory of him, a moment shared long ago. It didn't matter. What mattered was the connection, the bond she had with the fallen soldier. The woman placed the white flower gently on the ground next to the gravestone. Her fingers lingered there for a moment, as if she was offering something more than just the flower. It was as if she was offering part of her heart, her soul, as a tribute. The moment seemed timeless. For a few seconds, the entire cemetery appeared to hold its breath, as if everything was waiting, watching this simple, yet incredibly meaningful act of remembrance. There was nothing else in the world at that moment. Just the woman and the grave. Just the love she still held in her heart. For a long time she remained there, kneeling in front of the gravestone. Her head was slightly bowed, her eyes closed, and the silence around her was deep and unbroken. The royal guard stood watching from a distance, his mind racing with thoughts and feelings he couldn't fully explain. It was not his place to interfere, not his place to intrude on the woman's grief, but something about the scene before him stirred something deep inside of him. He had seen many people visit this cemetery, many families mourning the loss of loved ones, but this woman was different. There was a depth to her sorrow that seemed to echo in the stillness of the place. It was as if her heart had been carrying this weight for a long time, and coming here, to this particular grave, was a way for her to finally let it out. Her sadness was so palpable that even the air around her seemed to be filled with it. The royal guard had been trained not to let emotion interfere with his duty. He was here to protect the memory of those buried in the cemetery. He was here to make sure that every visitor could come and pay their respects in peace. But now, as he watched this woman, he found himself feeling something he hadn't expected: empathy. There was something deeply human about her grief, something that reached out and touched the part of him that had long been buried under the weight of his uniform. His training had taught him how to remain still, how to keep his face impassive, how to guard the memories of those who had fallen without ever showing weakness. But there, in that moment, he felt something stir within him, something that made him want to understand her pain, something that made him want to do more than just stand guard. As he watched the woman, he began to wonder who she was. He didn't know her name, didn't know the soldier who rested in front of her. All he knew was that there was a connection between them, a bond forged in the silence of the cemetery. The soldier lying beneath the stone had been her loved one. She had known him, cared for him, and likely lost him long before this day. And yet here she was, returning to the place where he now rested, to honor him in her own way. Her loss was not something he could ever truly understand, but in that moment he felt the depth of it in his own heart. It was then that the woman spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. The guard couldn't hear her words, but he could see the emotion in her face. Her lips moved slowly as if she was sharing something private, something only meant for the soldier who lay beneath the earth. There was no one else here, no one else who could hear her words, no one else who could offer her comfort. It was just her, and the memory of the man she had loved. For the first time since his training had begun, the royal guard found himself at a loss. He had always been taught to remain neutral, to distance himself from the emotions of others. But in the presence of the woman, in the quiet weight of her grief, he found that he couldn't help but feel something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. And then, as if by some unspoken signal, the woman slowly stood up from her kneeling position. She stood there for a moment, looking down at the grave, her hands folded tightly in front of her. There was a sense of finality in the air, as if she had shared her last words with the man she had lost. She stepped back from the gravestone, her eyes lingering on it for a moment longer, before turning to leave. The guard watched her as she walked away, her footsteps once again soft against the earth. In the stillness that followed, the royal guard stood motionless, lost in thought. There was something deeply moving about what he had just witnessed. A woman quietly mourning her lost loved one, and yet in her grief she had shared something with him. Something that transcended words, something that spoke to the very heart of what it meant to love and to lose. As she disappeared from view, the guard found himself feeling a sense of respect for her that he hadn't expected. She hadn't needed anyone's help. She hadn't needed anyone to speak for her or to comfort her. She had come here to this quiet cemetery, and in her own way she had found a way to honor the man she had loved. It was a simple act, yet it carried more weight than anything he had ever witnessed before. For a long while, the royal guard remained standing at his post, his eyes fixed on the place where the woman had just been. His thoughts were far away, lost in the quiet reflection of what he had seen. The world around him had returned to its usual stillness, but inside him, something had changed. Something deep and unspoken. And though he didn't know it yet, this quiet, fleeting moment would stay with him long after the day had ended. The woman had turned away from the grave, her steps slow but deliberate. She seemed to carry the weight of something unspoken with each movement, as if the cemetery had become a place for her to leave not only memories, but also the emotions that had been building up over the years. Her gaze remained on the path ahead, but for a brief moment her eyes lingered on the ground. It was as if she was trying to absorb the silence, trying to hold on to the peace she had found in this moment of solitude. The royal guard, still standing at his post, observed her every move. He had been trained to watch carefully, to be aware of everything around him. But today his attention was drawn to this one woman, whose grief and quiet strength were impossible to ignore. There was something about the way she carried herself that made her stand out from the others who visited the cemetery. She wasn't hurried, nor was she restless. She seemed to be here for a reason much deeper than just a visit. As she walked away from the grave, her figure growing smaller in the distance, the guard couldn't help but feel a strange pull in his chest. He was supposed to remain still, a statue of composure. His job was to protect the memories of the fallen, to stand silently as people mourned. But something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just guarding the graves today. He was a silent witness to a story of love, loss, and remembrance. As the woman continued her walk, the guard's mind began to drift. It wasn't just her grief that had touched him. It was the way she had spoken to the gravestone, as though she was having a conversation with someone still alive. He had seen countless mourners over the years, but never had he witnessed someone speak so personally to a grave. It wasn't the typical goodbye that many people said when they visited a loved one's resting place. It was something deeper, more intimate. He couldn't help but wonder who she was speaking to, what memories she was reliving in those quiet moments. The royal guard stood there, still as ever, but his thoughts were a whirlwind. He found himself wishing that he could understand her pain, her loss, even just for a brief moment. He wanted to know the story behind the grave, the story behind the woman. The soldier who had been laid to rest here had meant something to her, something important. The connection between them was clear, but what had happened to him? Why was he gone, and how had she managed to carry on without him? These questions, though unspoken, weighed heavily on his mind. As the woman continued walking down the path, the royal guard's attention remained fixed on her. He didn't know why. It wasn't like him to focus on a single person for so long. His training had always been about keeping his thoughts in check, about staying focused on the larger picture. But today something was different. Perhaps it was the vulnerability he had seen in her. Or perhaps it was the rawness of her grief that had pierced through the quiet walls he had built around himself. For a moment, he looked away. His eyes drifted to the grave she had just visited, the stone still standing proudly in the soft light of the evening. The name engraved on it was one he had seen countless times. It was one of many soldiers, each with their own story, each with their own loved ones left behind. And yet today, this particular soldier's memory felt different. It felt alive in a way that it hadn't before. The royal guard glanced back at the woman. She was almost at the gate now, nearing the exit of the cemetery. She wasn't looking back. She didn't need to. She had come and she had said what she needed to say in the quietest of ways. And now she was leaving, but something in the air had changed. It wasn't just the wind or the setting sun. It was something more profound. The cemetery, usually filled with silence, felt like it had shared a moment with her, a moment that would stay with the guard long after she had gone. Without even realizing it, the guard took a small step forward. He was still supposed to remain in place, to never move unless instructed to do so. But the quiet connection he felt with the woman had made him take that one small step. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the pull of her grief. Maybe it was the realization that there was more to his job than just standing guard. There was a deeper responsibility here. Something about honoring the fallen, yes, but also about honoring the ones left behind. Those who mourned, those who remembered. He couldn't explain it. But as he took that small step, he realized that it wasn't just the fallen soldier he was guarding. It was the memory of the people who had loved them, who had carried their stories with them through the years. And today it was this woman's memory, her love and her grief that had reached him in a way he never expected. His eyes followed her as she reached the gate. She was about to leave, to step out of this place, back into the world where life continued. But before she left, she paused. She stopped right at the gate just for a moment. The guard saw her shoulders rise and fall with a deep breath, as if she was taking one last look at the place where her heart had spent so many quiet moments. She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance back at the grave she had visited. The light of the evening sun touched her face, and for a brief second the guard saw her eyes glisten. She wasn't crying, but there was something in her expression that said everything. It was a mixture of love, loss, and peace. It was the kind of peace that comes only when you've said everything you need to say, even if no words have been spoken aloud. And then, with a soft sigh, she turned and walked out of the cemetery. leaving the royal guard to stand alone once more. But this time something had shifted. He wasn't alone, not really. He had witnessed something today that had touched him deeply, and it was something that would stay with him long after the evening had passed. As the gate clicked softly behind her, the guard stood there, his posture still perfect, but his mind alive with thoughts and emotions. The silence of the cemetery returned, but it felt different now. It felt as though the place had shared something with him, something important. The grave, the woman, her grief, it was all part of the same story, a story of love and remembrance that transcended time and death. The royal guard couldn't help but think about the soldier lying in the grave. He may have been gone, but his memory lived on, not only in the stone that marked his resting place, but in the people who still remembered him. And in that moment, the guard realized something he hadn't fully understood before. His duty was not just to stand still, to protect and preserve the memory of the fallen. His duty was to witness these stories, these quiet moments of grief and remembrance, and to honor them in his own way. For the first time in a long time, the guard didn't feel quite so alone. The woman had left, but the memory of her visit lingered in the air, filling the space between the graves with something that felt both sacred and real.